What does the other world want from us? What does that unseen realm require of us two-leggeds, us humans? That unseen realm that for many of us includes all of the natural world and forces beyond the natural world, everything outside our safe, warm houses. I'm Jay Leeming, and this is the Crane Bag Podcast. Today we're going to explore some of these questions. First through a story brought to us from the far north by the storyteller Walton Stanley. And then through a discussion with Mr. Walton Stanley about many of these questions. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me here. Let us begin.
This story happened long ago. So long ago, in fact, that some of the events may not have occurred yet. At that time, there weren't so many people in the world, and they were still figuring out the best way to make their way in the world. Now, at that time, there were some people that lived in the far north, the land of endless summer days and endless winter nights. And the way they lived was this. All the people of the north lived together. They had one round, large stone lodge that they had constructed, and they all lived together in that lodge. And what they would do is, in the spring and the summer, when the grip of the ice and snow had left the land and the waters, the people would go out and they would hunt and fish and trap and gather and collect as much food as they could, and they would store it in their stone lodge. And then in the fall, when the snows came, they would retreat into the lodge and they would close it up and they would live there on that food all winter long until the next spring. That's how it was. It worked pretty well. Maybe it went on like that for generations. I don't know. But what I do know is that one year, well, spring came late and the summer was kind of cold and rainy and fall and winter came early. And when the people closed up the lodge and went into the lodge for the winter and they took stock, they realized that they did not have enough food to make it through the winter. And so the people gathered with the elders in council. And what they decided to do was this. They decided that all the adults would stop eating. And they would sleep as much as possible, both to save their energy, because they weren't eating, and also to get their mind off the pangs of hunger in their bellies. And they thought that if all the adults stopped eating and slept all the time, well, maybe, just maybe some of the children might survive the winter. It's a terrible decision to have to make. It's a decision that some people still make, sadly, to this day. Not eating so that their children have enough. Well, the people settled into a pattern. The adults would spend the whole day sleeping, and then they would get up for a time, maybe in the afternoon, and make a little food for the children, and then they would go back to sleep and sleep the night away. Now, the children were left most of the day unsupervised in the lodge there. And they did what children do when they're unsupervised. They played together. They made up games. They ran around. It was kind of fun not having the adults messing with them. And among the children, there was one boy. He was the oldest boy in the group. He was kind of a ringleader. You know the type. He would often lead the children in games, and he would also kind of watch out for the little ones. Now, one day, the oldest boy went to the children, and he said, Hey, I know a new game we can play. What is it? Said the children. And he said, It's called Calling in the Spirits. How do you play? The kid said. Well, the oldest boy said, it's easy. You sit down over here, and I'll sit facing you, and then we'll make the lodge all dark and spooky, and I'll sing a song, and we'll see what happens. Sounds kind of dumb, the kid said. No, it'll be fun. And because he was the oldest boy and kind of a ringleader, he convinced them to go along with it. And so he sat the children down, and he sat with his back to the wall facing them. And then he took off his coat, and he covered the window with it so it would be dark in the lodge. And then he sang a song. Hey, Spirit, come to me. Hey, Spirit, come to me. I call upon the Spirit of the soul of the sea. Hey, Spirit, come to me. Hey, Spirit, come to me. I call upon the Spirit of the soul of the sea. And when he had sang the song for the third time, something strange began to happen. The stones in the floor of the lodge began to levitate, began to rise up and float through the air, and began to fly around the room, and the kids began to scream and holler and chase and jump after the stones and duck the stones as they were flying around, and they were all crazy and hollering, but the oldest boy sat there in kind of trance, and the whole thing went on all around him. Until at last he came out of it and he reached up and pulled his coat away from the window, and then all the stones settled down into their rightful places as if nothing had happened. And the kids were very excited, but the oldest boy went to them and he said, Now, let's keep this little game our little secret. Let's not tell the grown-ups. And all the children agreed, oh, yes, we'll keep it a secret. And later that afternoon, the adults woke up from their sleep, and they began to prepare a little food for the kids. And of course, the little kids, well, they kept that secret for about 45 seconds. And then they began to talk, and they told their parents, the oldest boy, he played this game, was calling in the spirits and the stones on the floor, and they moved all around. It was really spooky. It was crazy. And of course, word of this eventually reached the elders. And the elders in that time and in that place took such things seriously. And so they called the oldest boy to them. And they said, we've heard about this game of yours, this calling in the spirits. Show us. And so the oldest boy sat the elders down where he had sat the children, and he sat facing them with his back to the wall. And once again, he took off his coat, and he covered the window of the lodge so it would be dark in there. And once again, he sang the song, Hey, Spirit, come to me. Hey, Spirit, come to me. I call upon the Spirit of the soul of the sea. And when he had sung the song for the third time, this time, the stones on the floor did nothing. Now this time, they heard far off, outside the lodge, a roaring and a bellowing. It was the roaring of a polar bear and the bellowing of a walrus. And the roaring and the bellowing grew louder and louder as the two great animals came nearer and nearer to the lodge where the people were. The boy was still in a kind of trance. The elders listened until the roaring of the polar bear and the bellowing of the walrus were right outside the door of the lodge. And then the elders picked up the boy, still in a trance, and they carried him to a door. And they opened the door and they flung the oldest boy outside of the lodge. Now the oldest boy, his body didn't even hit the snow. It was caught midair by the polar bear, who swung his great head and flung the boy back high into the air. But again, the boy didn't land on the snow, for he was plucked out of the air under the tusks of the great walrus, who in turn swung his great head and body and flung the boy again back to the polar bear this time. and the polar bear and the walrus began to make their way across the land, flinging the boy back and forth, walrus to polar bear to walrus. They crossed the snow. Far off they went till they got to the sea ice, and they didn't stop there. They went right out onto the sea ice, still flinging the boy between them, polar bear to walrus, walrus to polar bear. When we got to the edge of the great cold green sea, they didn't stop there either. They dove down into that cold water with the boy with them, flinging the boy through the water. Polar bear to walrus, walrus to polar bear, and they dove down into the sea, down deep, deep. They swam deep into the sea, flinging the boy through the water as easily as they had flung him through the air. They flung him back and forth, walrus to polar bear to walrus. They dove down until they reached the very bottom of the sea. And there they entered a land under the sea. And in that land there was a river, and the polar bear and the walrus made their way upstream, up along that river, still flinging the boy, polar bear to walrus, walrus to polar bear, until they came to a bend in that river and the land under the sea. And there at the bend of that river was a little lodge, a little hut. And there the walrus and the polar bear flung the boy down, unconscious, on the gravelly banks of that river where the river bends. And then they went on their way. And the story might end there, but of course it doesn't. Eventually, after a long time or a short time, the boy regained consciousness. And he picked himself up and straightened his clothes and dusted himself off, and though he was somewhat the worse for wear for his journey, he was basically all right. And he looked around this strange land, not knowing quite exactly how he had gotten there. And he saw the little hut, the little lodge, and not knowing what else to do, he went inside. He went into the lodge, and in that first room of the lodge, he saw a door to another room, a second room. And he went into that room, and in that room, he saw the oldest woman he had ever seen, indeed, the oldest woman he could even imagine. She had a great, tangled shock of hair, white hair, cascading in all directions, coming up off her old head. Her face wrinkled, creviced like an old stone cliff. And he noticed also something strange. The woman had no hands. Her arms had been chopped off at the forearm, just below the elbows. He looked just beyond the woman, and there was a little table. And on that table, there was an ivory comb and a sealskin ribbon. And there was an obsidian bowl with some water in it, a kind of reflecting bowl. And the old woman turned and looked at him. No, not at him, looked through him, looked right into his eyes, fixed his gaze. And the old woman spoke. And she said, "What can you do for me?" And the oldest boy considered this question, as we should consider it now. What would we do if asked such a question by such a person? And what the oldest boy did was this. He went over to the table and he picked up the ivory comb. And he reached the end of the old woman's white hair, and he began very gently to comb out the tangled mess of her white hair. He began at the ends, holding it so that he didn't pull or hurt her, and very gently he continued the process of combing out that tangled mass of hair. And as he combed, he noticed that little sea creatures were being combed out of her hair. Small minnows and little crabs and little eels came out of the hair and flopped about and went on their way on the floor of the little lodge. He kept combing for what I presume was a long time. Up the hair, higher and higher up the hair, he undid all the tangles, combing carefully, gently, combing the sea life out of that tangled mass, and eventually, after a long time and many strokes of the comb, he eventually combed out all of her hair so that it was long and straight and shining and free of all the sea life that had been trapped there. It cascaded long across the woman's shoulders and down her back. But the oldest boy didn't stop there. When he had finished that, he combed the hair into strands and began to braid it in the way that the women of his village braided their hair, in the way he'd seen his mother do for his little sister, or his auntie do for his granny. He did the old woman's hair. He braided it up, and when he had finished braiding, he took that sealskin ribbon and he tied up the braid in the tradition of his people. And when this was done, the young man put the comb down on the little table. And the old woman turned, and she looked at her reflection in the obsidian bowl of water. And just the faintest smile danced across her eyes and her cheeks. And then she waved her arm, her handless arm, she waved at a little door, a little hatch in that room, and the hatch opened. And through that little door, that little hatch, came all the sea life in the world. There came fish and seals and sea lions and eels and crabs and whales and dolphins and all the myriad of life, and they went out through that room, out of her lodge, into that river in the land under the sea, and down that river out into the great sea itself they went and took their place in the great sea. On and on the parade of sea life went, until at last the old woman again waved her handless arm and said, "That's enough now." And the little door, the little hatch closed. And then the old woman instructed the young man on the right way to harvest the life of the sea, of the land, that the people might live. She taught him how to hunt the seal, and the way that after a hunter kills a seal, the hunter must give the seal a drink of fresh water, not salt, fresh water, so that the seal might have a taste of sweetness in the afterlife, and remember this kindness of the hunter, and that the seal might come back in another life and once again be generous. She taught the young man that the people must treat the seal bones with respect and not allow the dogs to run around with them, but to collect the bones of the seal after they had eaten the seal meat, and to bury them in a spot, maybe a hill overlooking the sea, and to say certain prayers. She taught them all this, the right way to harvest the life of the sea and of the land. And when she had done all that, she nodded to the young man that it was now time for him to leave. And he went out of that lodge, and he stood at the bend in that river on the gravel bank, wondering, I suppose, how he would ever get home, how he would get up to the surface of the sea, how he would swim across the sea, that cold, frozen sea to the ice pack and climb up on the ice and make his way back to his people. He wondered about that, but he didn't have to wonder for long, because in a moment, who should arrive but his old friends, the walrus and the polar bear. And the walrus picked the young man up under his tusks and swung his great head and flung that young man high into the air. And once again, he was plucked out of the air by the polar bear and flung back to the walrus. And again, the walrus and the polar bear began making their way, this time down the stream and out to the great sea, to the bottom of the sea. And again they flung him back and forth, polar bear to walrus, walrus to polar bear, through the water as easily as you or I would throw a ball through the air. They swam up and up and up until they reached the surface of the sea, and they did not stop there. They continued flinging the young man back and forth, walrus to polar bear to walrus, until they came to the ice, and they pulled themselves up onto the ice, and they continued flinging the young man, walrus to polar bear to walrus, across the ice until they reached the land. They went across the land, across that frozen tundra, across that land, across the snow, flinging the boy, flinging the young man, polar bear to walrus to polar bear, until they arrived at the place where the stone lodge of the people of the north was, and there they flung the young man down near the door of the lodge, and they went away roaring and bellowing. And when the roaring of the polar bear and the bellowing of the walrus subsided in the distance, the people, led by the elders, opened the door of the lodge, and there they saw the young man laying on the snow, unconscious. And they went out, and they picked him up gently, and they brought him into the lodge. He was near death, hovering between life and death. And they put him on a soft bed of furs near the fire. And some of the elders made a weak soup out of some of the remaining food they had. And after a time, they put a little of that soup on the lip of the young man. And when it touched his tongue, he opened his eyes. And he was suddenly filled with tremendous strength. And he sat up in the bed. And then he pulled himself to his feet. And he walked right outside the lodge. And he stood in the snow. And he lifted up his arms as if he were a great tree. He lifted them up to the sky and stood there with his eyes closed. And as he stood there like a great tree, birds began to roost on his arm. A flock of birds came down, and they filled both of his arms as they might the branches of a tree. And after his arms were full of birds, he grabbed the birds and broke their necks, and these he gave to the people to break their fast. And then he went out, and he made for himself a great harpoon. It was so big and so heavy that 10 strong men would have difficulty lifting it, but this he hefted as you or I might heft a small stick. And he went down to the sea, to where the ice meets the sea, and he looked out, and there he saw a whole shoal of seals. And he cast that harpoon, and he speared the entire shoal of seals, and he hauled them back, and he remembered what the old woman had taught him, and he gave each seal a drink of fresh water. And these he brought back to the people, and he taught them what the old woman had taught him. He taught them the proper way to harvest the life of the sea and the land. He taught them to give the seals a drink of fresh water, that they might remember a taste of something sweet as they went to the afterlife. He taught them not to let the dogs play with the seals' bones, but to treat them with respect and to bury them in a little hill overlooking the sea. And whether the people of that time and the people ever since remembered these things that he was taught, or whether they forgot, Well, I don't know. But I do know that if the people ever forget these things, it will become necessary for some oldest boy or oldest girl to once again make the journey under the sea to visit the old woman there and to comb her hair. Now, the whole story was overheard by an Arctic vole who made its nest under the lodge of the people when the people were telling this story. And so the story was carried by the vole people under the earth, and it might have remained there with them. But one year it happened that a young vole ventured out a little too far, and he was caught by a weasel. One of those white Arctic weasels, And the weasel ate that vole, and the story went into the weasel people. And so they carried the story for many generations of weasel. And that's what gives the story its tricky, quiet, clever twists and turns. And it might have remained with the weasels, but one year a young weasel was on the ice overlooking the sea. And he could see a fish down there, and he wanted that fish so badly. And he reached his paw out, trying to claw at that fish, and he lost his footing, and he fell into that cold sea, and that bank of the ice was too high for him to climb out. And he struggled for a time in those cold waters, but at last he just went to sleep in the water. And he drowned, and his lungs filled with water, and he became heavy and sodden, and he fell to the bottom of the sea. And like all things, all living things that fall to the bottom of the sea, well, he was eaten by crabs. And the story went into the crab people, and that's what gives the story its great depth. And it might have stayed there at the bottom of the sea with the crabs, but it so happened that one year, not so very long ago, some fishermen pulled up a load of crab. And they brought it to the port of Seattle, and they sold it in the fish market there. And it was bought by a restaurant, and it was turned into some crab chowder. And my friend, Danny Deerdorf, ate that crab chowder. And the story went into him, and he told me, and now I've told you.
All right, here we are at the Crane Bag Podcast, and today we have with us on the show Mr. Walton Stanley. Great to have you here, Walton.
Thanks, Jay. Good to be here.
Thank you for that amazing story. Is there a moment in that story which grabbed you when you first heard it and made you want to remember and tell this story?
Yeah, I think there are there are a number of moments in that particular story. Often at one particular moment, and this probably happens to you, where some image strikes you and you go like, "Oh yeah, this is an important story." And for me, I think there are several in that story, but probably the key one is the moment where he decides to comb the old woman's hair. It's such a simple and kind of delicate act, but it's just the absolute right thing to do in that moment. And of course, when she kind of, this amazing, powerful undersea figure, looks at him and says, "What can you do for me?" That's such a kind of startling question. And then for him to have that kind of silent, elegant response that is just absolutely the right thing to do, an amazing moment in that story. And I think also another moment is when the boy's in a trance, and he's called in the spirits in front of the elders, and suddenly this polar bear and walrus are coming outside, and the elders just pick him up and throw him out to the snow, to the polar bear and the walruses.
That's an amazing moment when the goddess at the bottom of the sea actually needs something from us, it turns out. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, that to me is kind of a key in the story, and why the story I think is relevant and important for us now, because it is a story about the need for some kind of reciprocal relationship between human beings and other beings, including kind of divine, powerful, the sea mother, if you will. And obviously when we forget to be in that relationship, when we pull ourselves out of that relationship, that's very dangerous. And I think we can all see the effects of the philosophy that we're not a part of that human beings are an animal apart that isn't part of nature, if you will. That idea is very dangerous and is leading to some very nasty results. So I think the story is important in that way, in that it establishes the importance of that relationship.
Yeah. We're not used to thinking of the gods as needing something from us, I suppose. And how do you, as a storyteller, relate to that figure, the goddess at the bottom of the sea? I mean, some would say she's just something made up by humans to describe the beauty and the anger of the sea, perhaps. But in this story, you are actually, I mean, the character is invoking her, and as a storyteller, you are too, are you not?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that the idea of goddess is something that that maybe comes out of civilization in a way. I mean, we apply that, but I think those beings may not be exactly that. I think that goddess notion is pretty loaded. So I sort of prefer to think of her as, as the mother of the sea, if you will, in that we need to have a kind of a relationship with her. And of course, in the kind of scientific sense, we all emerge from the sea in some way, shape, or form. Our blood has the same salinity as a primordial sea, not as the modern sea, but as the sea was when whatever ancestor it was that we come from, crawled up onto the land. So,
Yeah.
it really is our mother, or a mother or grandmother figure,
Mhm.
and I think maintaining a relationship with her is obviously important.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting to me as well in the story. The character of the oldest boy, he calls on the spirits. Right, he's in the lodge. And spirits
Yeah.
come to me, and then as a storyteller, you are in fact doing that in a way yourself. Is a story like this connected? Do you think to ritual and ceremony in the culture it comes from?
Well, it's a good question. It may well be. I mean, to me, stories are ways of carrying information, right? So they're ways of having observed patterns passed on throughout generations. So it may be in the culture that story comes from, that there are rituals related to that, but that I don't know. I mean, the story to me has value as a story and as a set of just incredibly powerful images as well. So there's probably a whole myriad of cultural layers that we don't understand, just because we're not in that culture, and the story is translated. I only know the story in English. So there's probably all kinds of connections we're not making, but still, I think the story has a lot of power and a lot of value, just even in the kind of pared down way that it comes to us.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you mentioned also the moment when the elders toss the boy out of the lodge there, which is terrific. Maybe that's what all teenagers need, I guess. What can you say anything more about that moment and why that grabbed
May-
you?
Well, maybe so, but I mean, it seems so like a kind of violent betrayal in a way. Obviously, it's the thing that needs to happen, but here's this kind of adolescent, or he's the oldest boy in the group. He's on the kind of verge of adulthood, I suppose, and and he's in this kind of vulnerable place. He's sort of in a trance, and and the elders chuck him out to a polar bear, and a walrus. But we know, obviously he survives the journey, but it's a pretty harrowing moment, and
Yeah.
and it's one of those things I think elders, yeah, in a way, have to do, right? You have to check the young out on their own into a situation like that where they do need to go down, and but still, when I first heard that, it came as a surprise. Like, that's what they're going to do? Throw him out to the polar bear.
Yeah. I was surprised by the because it's a pretty grim story in some ways to begin with. Everybody's starving, and I was surprised by the sudden sort of delight that happens once the children are left alone, which was unexpected to me and very, very beautiful in that story. I know.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of, I've had friends that went to work with refugee children in different places, in Greece, and in Mexico and things like that. And I mean, the capacity for children, even in really horrible and difficult circumstances, to find joy is pretty deep. But
Yeah. And you heard the story from Danny Deerdorf, you told us in the here. Anything you want to say about that? Or maybe you can just tell us, for the listeners, a little bit about who Danny is.
Well, Danny passed away not too long ago, but he was an incredible a storyteller and musician and thinker. And Danny would tell stories at the Minnesota Men's Conference. This story I actually heard a recording of, so this story was passed on to me by Ben Dennis, who I was telling the story with at a men's conference, and he had a recording of Danny doing this story. So I didn't get to hear Danny tell it live and in person, but yeah, Danny was an amazing storyteller and thinker.
Mhm.
And for those who don't know Danny was afflicted with polio at a young age, and his body was really really messed up, and he was confined to a wheelchair and things. But just an amazing person, and an amazing carrier of myth and story.
Yeah, yeah. And let's not forget he had a rock and roll career early on as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, a musician and a father, and yeah,
Yeah.
writer, and yeah.
So, Walton, how did storytelling begin for you? How did it arrive in your life, would you say?
Well, I started my career in theater as an actor, which is so in some ways related to storytelling, and in some ways not, I think. But performing and that kind of thing, and was always there. But storytelling for me, I was kind of turned on to storytelling with the men's conferences. So hearing, Robert Bly, tell Iron John for the first time, and hearing storytellers like Michael Mead and Martine Prechtel and Martin Shaw and Danny Deerdorf and some others tell stories was a really powerful experience for me, and and I think for a lot of people that were in that world. And then around 2013 or so, the men's conference was sort of moving on into kind of a new incarnation, if you will, and then Martin Shaw let us know that he wouldn't be able to come back the next year, and he was kind of moving on and doing more things over in the UK. So we were kind of left without. So I kind of jumped in along with Ben Dennis to kind of carry the stories for the conference, and I've been doing it ever since. So
Yeah. For some of our listeners who don't know much about the history involved here, can you briefly give us a picture of what the men's conference, that particular men's conference, was, and continues to be, and how story fits into it?
yeah, well, the men's conference was founded. The Minnesota Men's Conference was founded around 1984 by Robert Bly, and he had was starting to write about this story, Iron John, and he had actually done a magazine interview uh, uh, that was, I think, picked up in the Utne Reader and things like that, but on the Iron John story and on its significance and the idea that that there was kind of something lacking in men in modern society, in that there was some tempering, if you will, or initiation that wasn't being done, that had been cut off, that we'd lost. And so that was kind of the foundation of the men's conferences. In the popular media, they were kind of mocked and picked up as kind of a movement or a response to the feminist movement. But for those of us that were there, I don't think it was ever that. It was more of an exploration of the heart, if you will, an exploration of image, of stories, of mythic stories, of depth psychology, of poetry. So really going into the imagination and kind of going through a process of kind of tempering of the soul, if you will.
Mm.
So that was really what the conferences were about and are about. They continue kind of uninterrupted. They more recently they're less prominent and they're not kind of out in the popular imagination to the same degree as they were in the 80s and 90s. But we're still doing the work and getting together and telling stories and singing songs and reciting poetry and and then having deep discussions. So
Yeah. And maybe I should add, Robert did start the Great Mother Conference in the early 70s.
right, yeah. The Great Mother Conference came first, and then the men's conferences kind of evolved out of those, right?
Yeah. And I don't know if you've heard this story, Walton, but I've been told that at the Great Mother Conference, which was also an exploration of myth and story and poetry
Yeah.
and of depth of feeling, they told the Persephone story. And the women at the gathering decided it would be best to go away for a couple days, just as Persephone descends to the underworld. They wanted to go, in this case, across the lake. This happens in Maine, and spend like 2 nights over there. And so the group was split along gender lines, which it had not been before. And in that moment, Robert and others there realized how intense the grief of the men was, that did not always come out in a mixed group. Men are encouraged to be strong, right? And sorrow isn't something we're encouraged to feel. But anyway, the story I'm told is that that was one moment where he decided that a men's conference would be helpful to focus on that. So have you heard that story or not?
I have, or some version thereof. I'd heard something similar, that that I think the women kind of peeled off and left the men on their own, and to kind of the realization of that. I also I remember Robert saying that he felt that the women at that conference were pretty together. They were really kind of powerful human beings, but the men really had lacked something. Were a little I don't know, wishy-washy, if you will, or unfocused, if you will. But that was it, that had been the impetus for men's conference to separate by gender in that way for the men. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I mean, in worldly terms, it's not this simple, but women, of course, have all kinds of difficulties in the world in terms of getting paid less than men, less opportunities for math and science, etc. I don't need to go into the
Right.
list.
Right.
whereas men, you could say, in some ways, have advantages in that realm, but internally, sometimes it seems like as just as you say, men are kind of a mess. It's kind of a broken down house in there.
Right, right. Well, I mean, I think the capitalist system is a system that is essentially, abusive to the world. And of course, it's, you know, uh, people sort of benefit from it. Some portion of people benefit from it greatly, but it also, I think, is damaging to the human soul. I mean, it's like the story. We've lost contact. We've lost the connection. The old woman's hair is crazy and entangled, and we've lost the way, back to her. So I think that's obviously damaging for both men and women. But yeah, I mean, you're right. In the kind of mechanical world, men have maybe done better on the surface, I suppose, but down deep, I don't think it's good for anyone's soul.
Yeah. And how can story help us with all these problems? Would you say?
Well, I would say that that story works on a kind of different level. It kind of activates the imagination, and really it activates images that are almost non-verbal in a way. Obviously story is communicated through language. It's limited in that, but it's really dealing with images, and hopefully people who are both telling and listening to stories have images come up in their minds. And I think through exploring those images, we get to truths that are a little bit uh, deeper than can even be expressed in words. You get that sense of longing, that sense of connection or disconnection, and things like that. That becomes more conscious in us. So yeah, I think stories really important, and I think old mythic stories are kind of collections of ancestral wisdom about the right way to live in the world, right? And so that's kind of what we're all kind of looking for right now.
Yeah, yeah. In your own life, have there been stories which have you found yourself sort of living inside in a moment, like, oh, that's me in that story?
Oh yeah, many times. There are stories that you find yourself in a situation, and a memory of a story will come to you, and you'll say like, oh, that's like what happened to so and so in that story, or I'm in that situation, and here's what we do now. The interesting thing with those old mythic stories is they're kind of paradoxical. So sometimes the correct thing is to be upright and tell the truth, and sometimes the absolute correct thing is to lie through your teeth. The stories I find are not moralistic. We tend to think that stories have a moral, if they will, but I think they tend to have more strategies and tactics than morals.
Do you have any ideas about where these stories start in the world, like where they come from? I mean, are they a human? Some would say a story is like a wild animal. You need to kind of feed it and bring it into your life if you're lucky to have it come at all.
Yeah.
Others would say it's a human thing that humans made up. How do you look at it?
Well, I look at it as I think the stories themselves are kind of extra human, but they're works of the human imagination, trying to recognize patterns that exist in the world, and energies that exist in the world. And it's doing it imagistically. My sense is that story is a way to kind of, in a way, disenchant the world. I mean, we famously think of these are stories of enchantment, but there are ways of breaking through, I think, notions and structures and things that we think about, and enable us to recognize patterns in new ways.
I think Danny himself once said, rationality is a trance state, and a story can help us break through that. I think.
Yeah, yeah, that's really well said. I completely agree. I think rationality is, rationality is making up reasons for things. But those reasons aren't necessarily based in truth. They're just sort of, excuses for they're stories in themselves, but they're not necessarily true stories.
Yeah, yeah. And do you tell stories largely from indigenous traditions, or where do you look for stories, or what cultures do you look at?
Well, my experience is that the stories sort of find me. I don't tend to prefer, you know, one culture. I mean, I tell stories from, from Grimm's and the European traditions and the Mabinogi and but also indigenous stories of different places come up, and they're, even the kind of remnants that we have of them that were sort of written down are often just incredible stories, and they relate to our lives today. So,
Hmm. And you grew up. What's the landscape you grew up in? Can you paint that a little bit for us?
well, I grew up in Wisconsin, mostly in a suburb of Milwaukee, and was just kind of a middle class Wisconsin guy. Got interested in theater and went to school and studied that. I was always, I remember as a young boy reading myths, like myths of the Greeks and Romans and things like that. And it seems like that mythic landscape was always part of, well, what I was about.
Being descended from Europeans, as you are, as I am, we're in a funny situation, wouldn't you say, as storytellers, because we bring this cultural heritage with us, the Greek myths, the Grimm fairy tales, etc. But we are on this continent, Turtle Island, which is filled with stories that were told for thousands of years by the Indians, so to speak, by the Haudenosaunee, by the Lakota, by the indigenous people here. How do you dance between those two worlds, between those two facts?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's really true. I mean, we're a legacy of colonialism, right? And the kind of horrible things that went on with all that. Miguel Rivera, who helps lead the conferences and has connections with a number of native traditions, and what he says is that, when the Europeans came here, our ancestors came here, they didn't really do the right things. They didn't kind of sit down with the people that were indigenous here and kind of introduce each other's ancestors in a good way. That wasn't done, and so, part of this work is kind of is doing the work that should have been done back then. Is kind of getting everybody's ancestors kind of sat down together and working things out.
Yeah. And so by telling stories, we can help that to happen.
I think so. Yeah.
And do they hear? Do our ancestors hear? Do the spirits in the land hear when stories are told around a fire or something like that?
Yeah, I think they definitely do. And at conferences, the other step, of course, is we sort of ritualize some images of the story. So in a way, we kind of dance those stories back onto the land. So if you've been to the conference sites, you can look back and remember, like, this is where a particular ritual was on this land, and you remember the image and what was constructed there and what was done and what was said,
Yeah.
what happened and things like that. So the story kind of gets put back into the land, if it will.
Yeah. That's a beautiful phrase, dancing it back into the land. For some of our listeners, can you perhaps tell us a little more about how that might actually be done?
Well, I think when you've heard a story in a small group, especially a live story around a fire and things like that, and then you kind of get together and you don't literally reconstruct the story, but you work with images from the story, and you try to feed the spirits, if you will. So you make, you build little shrines and little moments that kind of reconstitute the story in a physical way. So you bodily kind of walk through some kind of progression that's in the story, and and then when you do that, then that story gets attached, to the land, because there's a beech tree, and there was a particular shrine that was built around it, and you remember what that looked like and how that felt and what it smelled like and things like that. And you remember the kind of the part of the story, if you will, that might have been attached to that shrine, right? So then the story kind of gets put back into the land.
Mm, mm. That's very beautiful. It's amazing. I don't think we quite get that in this culture. We tend to, we think of stories as living in books, but from what you're saying, it sounds like you conceive of them as not living in books necessarily.
Yeah, well, I see books as and writing in a way as it's kind of a seed. So it's a story gone to seed, if you will. So it's the difference between an acorn and an oak, right? The seed contains the kind of genetic information, if you will, of what the story can become, but it isn't until it's brought out through a human being, through a human body, through human voice, and through human ears, that the story actually grows. And then, obviously in a human being, in a human psyche, once the story is planted, it continues working in there, right?
As a child, stories grabbed me, but the stories which were available were they were corporate stories from film and from TV. And of course, I did what all children do, is I put those stories in the land with my friends playing in the backyard or the forest and things like that. So that seems to be a fundamental human impulse, don't you think?
I think so, and I think also, there's an interesting book called The Memory Code, and the premise of it is that oral cultures, if you will, basically used the land around them as mnemonic devices. So there'd be a particular rock or tree or mountain or stream or whatever it was, and people were kind of semi-nomadic. They would kind of make a cycle at different seasons because, different things were coming into bloom or season, and they would go harvest food from them, so that people would kind of make a circuit of their territory, if you will, and the territory was alive with story. So when you got to a particular rock, then, certain people would get to hear the story that was attached to that place and remember it. So.
Mm. That's amazing. So the story lives in the landscape in a very real way.
Yeah, yeah.
And at the same time, this sort of cultural collision, which we are living through here on Turtle Island in North America, has happened before, right? Happened all over the world. For example, when the Romans came to England and they brought with them gods and goddesses like Minerva and Jupiter, things like that. But they they came to a place already alive with gods and goddesses and stories as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think they're, in Roman stables in England, they had statues of Danu, and, who they called Ipana, but, it was the horse goddess we would call maybe Rhiannon or something like that. But, the Romans were very good at saying, like, oh, well, that's the local iteration of that energy or that spirit, but they were able to kind of understand it and translate it.
So they translated the local spirits into their own sort of vernacular.
Yeah, and they would just, they would understand them as, well, in Rome, we call her this, but here she has a different name, and that's fine, and we'll just go with that.
Yeah. And I guess from what you're saying, they didn't try to entirely destroy what was there before.
Right. Although, the Romans, horrible in many ways, some of their power was in not trying to destroy the local spiritual layer.
My guest today has been Walton Stanley, a storyteller from Minnesota. You can find out more about him and his work at waltonstanley.com, STANLEY.com. And this is the Crane Bag Podcast. Thank you for listening. And if you can support this podcast, please do so. That helps make it available to others. A great way to do that is through Patreon, where you can support this podcast and storytelling that gets out in the world. Thanks to those who have been able to support this podcast. And hello to all. Take care and be well.